All right, this PowerPoint is titled "The Resurgence of Conservatism," but it's really a PowerPoint of the 1980s, and of course it mentions 1992. It will kind of end with Bush in '92. Reagan used the slogan in his re-election campaign. It's "Morning in America." The 1980s, the average American was older than in the stormy 60s. And this conservative cause drew added strength from the emergence of what was called a new right that focused on cultural issues like abortion, pornography, homosexuality, feminism, and affirmative action. Politicized evangelical Christian groups such as the Moral Majority became leading actors in New Right campaigns. Reagan was well suited to lead the gathering conservative crusade in the 1980s. He comfortably sided with the New Right on social issues. In economic and social matters alike, he denounced the activist government and failed social engineering of the 1960s, just as his early political hero Franklin Roosevelt had championed the forgotten man against big business. Reagan championed the common man against big government. Reagan hardly rested as he got going after his election to really kind of savor the sweetness of his victory. The second part of his economic program had called for substantial reductions in marginal tax rates over a period of 3 years, income taxes over 3 years. The theory that drove Reagan's push for massive income tax reduction was known as supply-side economics. Supply-siders argued that a combination of budgetary discipline and tax reductions would stimulate new investment, invigorate productivity, foster dramatic economic growth, and eventually even boost rather than deplete tax revenues, thus reducing the federal deficit. At first, supply-side economics seemed to be a beautiful theory mugged by a gang of brutal facts, as the economy slid into its deepest recession since the 1930s. Unemployment reached nearly 11% in 1982, businesses folded, several banks failed, and it jolted the nation's entire financial system. The anti-inflationary tight money policies that led to the so-called Reagan recession of 1981-1982 had actually been launched by the Federal Reserve Board way back in 1979 on Carter's watch. Reagan and his economic advisors serenely waited for their supply-side economic policies to produce the promised results. The supply-siders seemed to be vindicated when a healthy economic recovery finally got underway in 1983. Income gaps widened, though, between the richest and the poorest Americans. The poor got poorer and the very rich grew richer. Symbolic of the new income stratification was the emergence of what was called the yuppies, or young urban professionals. It was massive military expenditures, though, that constituted the real foundation of 1980s prosperity. Nearly $2 trillion would go into the Pentagon during the 1980s. Massive government borrowing to cover those deficits kept interest rates high, and high interest rates in turn elevated the value of the dollar to record altitudes in the international money markets. So if you traveled, you were happy, but not so much in trade into America. And unfortunately, then America suddenly became the world's heaviest borrowers in the global economy of the 1980s. Reagan believed in negotiating with the Soviets, but only from a position of overwhelming strength. By enormously expanding U.S. military capabilities, he could threaten the Soviets with a fantastically expensive new round of arms race. The American economy, he felt, could better bear this new financial burden than could the creaking old Soviet Union system. Reagan played his trump card on this risky game in March of '83 when he announced his intention to pursue a high technology missile defense system called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, sometimes known as, or given the name, Star Wars, because it was so out there. The plan called for orbiting battle stations in space that could fire laser beams or other forms of concentrated energy to vaporize intercontinental missiles right on liftoff. In 1983, relations grew even more tense when the Soviets blasted from the skies a Korean passenger airliner that had inexplicably violated Soviet airspace. Still a question remains over that airspace idea, but hundreds of civilians, including Americans, plummeted to their deaths in the frigid sea of Okhotsk. By the end of 1983, all arms control negotiations with the Soviets were broken off. And the chill of the Cold War deepened further in 1984 when the USSR and the Soviet bloc athletes boycotted the Olympic Games in Los Angeles. The ever-volatile Middle Eastern pot continued to boil. Israel badly stained its bond of friendship with the United States by continuing to allow new settlements to be established in the occupied territory of the Jordan River's West Bank. You can see it on the map on your left. Israel further raised the stakes in the Middle East in June 1982 when it invaded neighboring Lebanon, seeking to suppress once and for all the guerrilla bases from which Palestinian fighters harassed Israel. Reagan was obliged to send American troops to Lebanon in 1983 as part of an international peacekeeping force, but their presence really didn't bring peace. A suicide bomber crashed an explosive truck into a United States Marine barracks on October 23, 1983, killing more than 200 Marines. Reagan soon withdrew the remaining American troops while somehow miraculously suffering no political damage from this humiliating attack. Opponents began to call him the Teflon president because of that, because Teflon, nothing sticks to it. Central America in the United States' own backyard also rumbled menacingly. The leftist revolution had deposed the longtime dictator of Nicaragua in 1979. Carter had tried to ignore the hotly anti-American rhetoric of the revolutionaries. They were known as Sandinistas, and he tried to establish a good diplomatic relationship with them. But Reagan took their rhetoric at face value and hurled back at them some hot language of his own. He accused the Sandinistas of turning their country into a forward base for the Soviet Union and Cuban military penetration of all Central America. High-flying spy planes claimed that Nicaraguan leftists were shipping weapons to revolutionary forces in tiny El Salvador. Reagan sent military advisors to prop up the pro-American government of El Salvador, and also provided covert aid, including the CIA-engineered mining of harbors to the rebel Contras. Contras were opposed to these anti-American governments in Nicaragua. In a dramatic display of American might, in October '83, Reagan dispatched a heavy firepower invasion force to the island of Grenada, where a military coup had killed the prime minister and brought Marxists to power. American troops vividly demonstrated Reagan's determination to assert the dominance of the United States in the Caribbean. In his bid for a second White House term in '84, Reagan's opponent was Democrat Walter Mondale, who made history by naming as his vice presidential running mate Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro of New York. She was the first woman ever to appear on a major party presidential ticket. Reagan walked away with 525 electoral votes to Mondale's 13. Foreign policy issues dominated the news in his second term. The president soon found himself contending for the world's attention with a charismatic new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was installed as chairman of the Soviet Communist Party in March 1985. Gorbachev committed to radical reforms in the Soviet Union. He announced two policies with remarkable, even revolutionary implications: glasnost, or openness, aimed at ventilating the secretive, repressive stuffiness of Soviet society by introducing free speech and a measure of political liberty, and perestroika, or restructuring. This was intended to revive the morbid Soviet economy by adopting many of the free market practices, such as the profit motive and an end to subsidized prices of the capitalist West. Both glasnost and perestroika required that the Soviet Union shrink the size of its enormous military machine and redirect its energies to the dismal civilian economy. That requirement, in turn, necessitated an end to the Cold War. Gorbachev accordingly made warm overtures to the West, including an announcement in April of '85 that the Soviet Union would cease to deploy intermediate-range nuclear forces, INFs, targeted at Western Europe. In December '87, the two leaders at last signed an INF treaty banning all these missiles from Europe. Reagan and Gorbachev capped their new friendship in May of '88 at a final summit in Moscow. Reagan made other decisive moves in foreign policy. His administration provided strong backing in February '86 for Corazon Aquino's ouster of dictator Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. He also ordered a lightning air raid against Libya in '86 in retaliation for alleged Libyan sponsorship of terrorist attacks, including a bomb blast in West Berlin discotheque that killed U.S. servicemen. But two foreign policy problems seemed insoluble to Reagan: the continuing captivity of a number of American hostages seized by Muslim extremist groups in battered Lebanon, and the continuing grip on power of the left-wing Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Congress repeatedly refused, and the administration obsessed in its search for a means to help the Contras, who were opposed to the Sandinistas. Some Washington officials saw a possible linkage between the two thorny problems of the Middle Eastern hostages and the Central American Sandinistas. In '85, American diplomats secretly arranged arms sales to Iran, which was mired in a devastating territorial war with bordering Iraq. In return, the Iranians helped obtain the release of at least one American hostage held by Middle Eastern terrorists. The money Iran paid for the American weapons was then diverted to the Contras in Nicaragua. And these actions kind of violated a congressional ban on military aid to the Nicaraguan rebels. One of the guys at the center of this is pictured at the left. His name is Oliver North. That's his lawyer to the right of him. News of these secret dealings broke in November '86. Reagan claimed he was innocent of wrongdoing and ignorant of his subordinates' activities. The public clamored to know what the president knew and when he knew it. This was known as the Iran-Contra affair, and it cast a dark shadow over Reagan's record on foreign policy, intended to obscure his outstanding achievement in establishing a new relationship with the Soviets. Reagan had taken office vowing to invigorate the American economy by rolling back government regulations, lowering taxes, and balancing the budget. Supply-side economic theory had promised that lower taxes would actually increase government revenue because they would stimulate the economy as a whole. But in fact, the combination of tax reduction and huge increases in military spending opened a vast revenue hole of $200 billion annual deficits. The staggering deficits of Reagan's years assuredly constituted a great economic failure, though. But they also constituted, strangely enough, a kind of political triumph. His sky-high budget deficit served exactly that purpose of making new social spending both practically and politically impossible for the foreseeable future. And for better or for worse, the consequences of Reaganomics would be large and durable. In 1979, the Reverend Jerry Falwell launched a political advocacy group called the Moral Majority. Falwell preached with great success against sexual permissiveness, abortion, feminism, and the spread of gay rights. In their movement zeal, and morally charged political approach, members of the religious right sometimes resembled the left-wing protesters of the 1960s. In many ways, the religious right of the 1980s was a reflection of or answer to 60s radicalism. Like advocates of multiculturalism and affirmative action, the religious right practiced a form of identity politics. Rather than defining themselves as, say, Latino voters or gay voters, they declared themselves Christian or pro-life voters. Several leaders of the religious right fell from grace in the latter part of the decade in several scandals. The courts had become a principal instrument of Reagan's in the cultural wars demanded by Christian conservatives. Equally important, Reagan had named 3 conservative-minded justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. One included Sandra Day O'Connor. Sandra Day O'Connor was the first woman to ascend to the high bench in the court's nearly 200-year history. Reagan repudiated 2 great icons of the liberal political culture, affirmative action and abortion. In 2 cases in 1989, Ward's Cove Packing versus Antonia and Martin versus Wilkes, the court made it more difficult to prove that an employer practiced racial discrimination in hiring and made it easier for white males to argue that they were the victims of reverse discrimination by employers who followed affirmative action practices. The contentious issue of abortion also reached the court in 1989. In the case of Roe versus Wade in 1973, the Supreme Court had prohibited states from making laws that interfered with a woman's right to an abortion during the early months of pregnancy. In Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, the court in 1989 seriously compromised Roe's protections by approving a Missouri law that imposed certain restrictions on abortion, further inviting states to legislate in an area in which Roe had once seemed to forbid them. The court ruled in 1992's Planned Parenthood versus Casey that states could restrict access to abortion as long as they did not place an undue burden on the woman. The Democratic nomination in the end went to the coolly cerebral governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. Republicans nominated Reagan's Vice President George H.W. Bush, who ran largely on Reagan's record of tax cuts, strong defense policies, toughness on crime, opposition to abortion, and a long-running, if hardly robust, economic expansion. In the end, Bush wins. George Herbert Walker Bush had been born into a rich family. He also served in World War II, made it rich himself in Texas oil, but was committed to public service and vowed to sculpt a kinder and gentler America. In 1989, it seemed that democracy was reviving in previously communist hotspots. In China, hundreds of thousands of pro-democracy demonstrators thronged through Beijing's Tiananmen Square in the spring of '89. But in June of that year, China's aging and autocratic rulers brutally crushed the pro-democracy movement. Tanks rolled over the crowds, and machine gunners killed hundreds of protesters. Stunning changes also shook Eastern Europe. Long oppressed by puppet regimes, propped up by Soviet guns, the region was revolutionized in just a few startling months in '89. The Solidarity movement in Poland led the way when it toppled Poland's communist government in August. Regimes collapsed in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and even hyper-repressive Romania. In December '89, jubilant Germans danced atop the hated Berlin Wall, symbol of the division of Germany and all of Europe into 2 armed and hostile camps. The wall itself soon came down. Communist systems attempted to dislodge Gorbachev with a military coup in August '91. With the support of Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, Gorbachev was able to foil the plotters, but his days were numbered. In December of '91, Gorbachev resigned as Soviet president. He'd become kind of a leader without a country as the Soviet Union dissolved into its component parts, some 15 republics loosely confederated in the Commonwealth of Independent States, with Russia the most powerful state and Yeltsin the dominant leader. They embraced democratic reforms and a free market economy, and so the demise of the Soviet Union really kind of wrote a definitive finish to the Cold War era. But rankling questions remain. For example, who would honor arms control agreements with the United States? Which of the successor states of the former Soviet Union would take command of formidable Soviet nuclear arsenals? Or who's going to take the Soviet Union's seat on the United Nations Security Council? And of course, eventually, it would be Russia. In 1993, Bush signs the START II Accord with Russia President Boris Yeltsin, committing both powers to reduce their long-range nuclear arsenals by 2/3 within 10 years. A particularly nasty conflict would erupt in the Russian Caucasus in 1991 when the Chechenian minority tried to declare its independence from Russia. This prompted Yeltsin to send in Russian troops. Ethnic warfare flared in other disintegrating communist countries as well, notably in misery-drenched Yugoslavia. Now that the USSR was dissolved and there was no longer a Cold War, America's economy kind of started to suffer too. There's no reason to build up an arsenal. During the Cold War, the US economy was really kind of dependent on that. Elsewhere in the world, democracy marched triumphantly forward. The white regime in South Africa recognized the impossibility of preserving its racist apartheid rule in the face of effective black resistance and an ostracizing world, and in 1990 freed African leader Nelson Mandela. 4 years later, Mandela gets elected to South Africa as their president. And you're also going to see free elections in Nicaragua in February of 1990. They'll remove the leftist Sandinistas from power. And 2 years later, peace comes at last to war-ravaged El Salvador. Then the Persian Gulf crisis. August 1990, Iraq leader Saddam Hussein invades oil-rich Kuwait, hoping to annex it and control its oil to replenish debts incurred during his Iraq and Iran war. The UN responded swiftly, placing economic embargoes on the aggressor and demanding an immediate withdrawal of his troops by January 15, 1991. Hussein refuses to comply, and so America spearheads a massive international military deployment. January 16th, the US and the UN, United Nations, launched a 37-day airstrike. American General Norman Schwarzkopf, he's there pictured on the upper right, inspecting troops, planned airstrikes followed with a tidal wave of land troops. On February 23rd, Operation Desert Storm begins, and it lasted 4 days. Hussein's finally forced to sign a ceasefire on February 27th, and then goes into hiding. George H.W. Bush partly redeemed his pledge to work for a kinder, gentler America when he signed the American with Disabilities Act, ADA, in 1990, a landmark law prohibiting discrimination against the 43 million U.S. citizens with physical or mental disabilities. He also signed a major water project bill in 1992 that aimed to reform the distribution of subsidized federal water in the arid West. This bill sought to put the interests of the environment on par with those of agriculture, especially in California's heavily irrigated Central Valley, and to provide more water to the West's thirsty cities. In 1991, he signed a watered-down civil rights bill that prevented discrimination in hiring. In 1991 also, he nominated for the Supreme Court the conservative African-American jurist Clarence Thomas. Thomas was finally approved by the Senate despite accusations from Anita Hill that Thomas had sexually harassed her. Still more damaging to President Bush's political health was the economy. It sputtered and stalled almost from the outset of his administration, and by 1992, the unemployment rate exceeded 7%. The federal budget deficit continued to mushroom cancerously, topping $250 billion in each of Bush's years as president. In a desperate attempt to stop the hemorrhaging of red ink, Bush agreed in 1990 to a budget increase that included $133 billion in new taxes. Bush's 1990 tax and budget package added up to a political catastrophe for him. In his '88 presidential campaign, Bush had belligerently declared, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Now he had flagrantly broken that campaign promise. And that's the picture that you see on the bottom left there. That was his campaign promise of "read my lips."